A very warm welcome everyone to the Maritime Education Podcast. My name is Barry Sadler and welcome to our next episode, which I'm going to focus on the size of container ships and how they have changed over the past 40 years. Last night I brought in the Hyundai Merchant Marine container ship, the HMM Southampton. Now, it was really nice bringing a ship into Southampton that carried the same name, and it's always a special occasion when any vessel that carries the name Southampton, or indeed is registered in the port of Southampton, comes in. The HMM Southampton is a Megamax container ship. She's one of the latest Category 7 container vessels, and she's big. She was built in 2020 and she's around 400 metres long. She has a beam of 61.5 metres and a 20-foot equivalent unit capacity of just short of 24,000, 23,820 TEUs. Although her summer draft can be as deep as 16.5 metres, she came in fairly deep yesterday at 14.35 metres, which gave her a displacement of just slightly over 231,000 tonnes. That's a big ship. That's at the top end of container ships, and quite frankly, are we going to get any bigger? Well, we'll talk about that a little bit later on. We berthed the ship at a berth known as SCT 5, Southampton Container Terminal's berth number 5. It's just round the corner from Southampton Container Terminal's berth number 4, which used to be the old berth 204 when the container terminal wasn't owned by its current owners. Berth 204 means a lot to me, as on the 3rd of November 1985 I joined my first ship, the Ben Avon, at berth 204. Now, the Ben Avon was, at the time, one of the world's biggest container ships. Now, if I compare some of the numbers with the Ben Avon to the ship that I brought in yesterday, you'll see how we've had almost a tenfold increase in the number of containers that were carried on ships from the 80s to ships that are steaming around in the current day. So my first ship, the Ben Avon, a pure container ship, just like the HMM Southampton. She was only 288 metres long. She was a Panamax vessel, which meant that she was only 32 metres in beam. Built in 1973, she carried 3,032 TEUs. Now, the gross tonnages of the two ships, the physical size, if you like, of the two ships are almost incomparable. The HMM Southampton's up there at 230,000, whereas the Ben Avon right down there at 56,000. So a significantly smaller vessel. It's interesting to see how these size of vessels have evolved over the years, and indeed the reasons that they have evolved over the years as well. Now, when I joined that first ship, she was portside 2 on 204 berth. She was sat there ready to start her European coast and then onwards from there to the Far East. Very, very similar loops that we see even in the modern container ship trade. So we would go from Southampton, we'd go to Hamburg, Bremerhaven, Rotterdam, Le Havre, back to Southampton, and then from Southampton we would head out to the Far East via the Mediterranean, the Suez Canal, calling in at Jeddah, and then straight across the Indian Ocean for a few ports in the Far East. It was either what we used to call the Hong Kong run or what we used to call the Tokyo run. So the Hong Kong run consisted of Kuala Lumpur or Port Kelang, which is the port, Singapore, Hong Kong, and then up to Kaohsiung in Taiwan. Whereas the Tokyo trip used to take us pretty much all the way through to Tokyo, Kobe and Osaka on the Japanese coast, before returning. The only common Far East port between those two runs was indeed Singapore. So two very, very different runs we used to do on the Ben Avon. In the modern loops that come to and from the Far East, the ports are very, very much scaled down. Nowhere near as many European ports and nowhere near as many Far East ports. And of course now, since China became such a huge trading nation, most of the vessels will call at a significant port in China, Qingdao or Beijing, one of the other big Chinese container ports. It's the size of container ships really that I want to talk a little bit about today, because this really has been a colossal expansion in container ships. And if you think about it, in the world of global trade, very, very few symbols capture the scale and efficiency of modern logistics like a container ship does. I've just shown you that in my 40-year career, we've gone from 3,032 TEUs to 23,820 TEUs. So we've got a massive increase in the size of ship, representing a massive increase in the efficiency of modern logistics. We know that goods around the world, 90% of them are transported via sea, and therefore these ships have demonstrated a dramatic transformation in their size and capacities, from those very, very modest vessels of the 1980s right up to the mega max container ships of today. They are an indication of global supply chain, changes in port infrastructure, and changes in general in maritime economics. When I first started at sea in the 1980s, containerization was starting to be highly refined. Malcolm McLean, of course, who introduced the concept of containerization in the 1950s, saw his 20-foot units start to escalate and the use of them become pretty much the norm by the time we got into the 70s. The 80s was really a dawn of global containerization, because in the 80s the high-speed express runs were developed. Indeed, the Ben Avon, the ship that I was a cadet on, that ship was initially a steamship capable of doing 31.5 knots. This meant that she could provide an express service between the Far East and Europe, bringing goods back in the minimum amount of time. Now, whilst I was on that ship, she went via the Suez Canal. I know a lot of ships are going around the Cape these days to avoid the problems at the bottom end of the Red Sea. But in those days, we would go through Suez, and therefore it was a very, very fast turnaround. Even when I was on the ships where they had been converted into diesel engines away from steam, using a lot less fuel, so we went from using about 500 tons, yes, 500 tons of fuel a day, down to burning around 170, 180 tons of fuel a day. Even with her diesel engines, she was capable of doing 26 and a bit knots, which again is a very, very fast service to and from the Far East. These modern container ships struggled to get 20 knots. That's mainly because of their size and because of the engines needing to be as efficient as possible rather than being as powerful as possible. We're now going for more of a green result from our engines rather than an express result from our engines. Now, the average container vessel in the 80s would carry between sort of 2,000 to 3,000 TEUs, which is why I say my first ship at 3,032 TEUs was considered at the time to be a fairly large container vessel. Towards the end of the 80s, this had jumped up to just over 4,000 TEUs, with American President lines, as they were at the time, bringing out what were considered to be huge ships. Those class of vessels, as I say, Far East runs, but they also primarily serve trans-Pacific and transatlantic routes as well. And despite their relatively modern size by today's standards, they did require significant coordination and began pushing port authorities to start to upgrade facilities even in the 80s at their size. If we move on to the 1990s and 2000s, I moved off container ships in 1989 and went to cruise ships. But there was rapid globalization in the 1990s and early 2000s, with a lot of manufacturing shifting to Asia and of course particularly China. And as I've mentioned before, this led to new ports being introduced on those Far East runs, and this demand in surge led to a new generation of larger container ships coming in the 1990s. Post-Panamax vessels, i.e. those vessels that were too large to go through the then Panama Canal at 32 metres beam, were brought into service. They didn't need to do Panama because they could come from the Far East to Europe without having to go through the canal. And therefore, the 1990s saw container ships growing in girth beyond that Panamax limiting 32 metre beams up to sort of 38 metres, which increased the TEU capacity. Slightly longer, we're between the 1990s and 2000s up to about 6,000 to 8,000 TEU. And then came a milestone with the introduction of the first ultra-large container ship, the MMS, which was launched in 2006. It then completely changed the face of container carriage to and from the Far East, with a then record capacity of 15,500 TEUs. It marked the beginning of the E-Class by Maersk Line and ushered in this new era of huge mega container ships. These ships were not only designed for capacity but also for fuel efficiency, and this sort of restructured the economy of scale as we knew it. Now, those Maersks and, well, the E-Class Maersks were big ships, but they weren't particularly easy ships to handle. They were twin screw and they did have problems with bow thrusters and rudders, which it was thought was really a factor of the fact that they were so huge, they were so big, brought in very, very quickly. But once the 2010s came in, then we started to see these ultra-large container vessels being built. Driven by further globalization and lower shipping costs, many alliances were formed between shipping companies that came together to create what we know as loops between the major trading areas, the biggest of which still remains, of course, the Far East to Europe. This globalization saw the introduction of ULCs, and we began to get our 18,000 TEU container ships being developed. These ships were around the 360 to 370 metre in length. They were around 50 metres beam, perhaps slightly under 48 metres beam, and they started to accelerate past the Maersk's E-Class up to around the 18,000 TEU mark. Now, these ships, because they had got so huge, were fitted with very, very efficient diesel engines. Efficient diesel engines are great because obviously they bring down carbon emissions, they bring down the use of fuel, better for the environment. But the trouble with these very, very efficient ultra-large container vessels was that they had problems getting in and out of the ports. In the 2010s, the ports were really being stretched with the size of ship that was coming to and from them. The channels were still relatively narrow and the berths relatively small, and therefore these very, very low turning, slow speed diesel engines, although highly efficient at pushing along these 18,000 TEU ships, made them a bit of a challenge for pilots. Now, in the port of Southampton, we saw this with the introduction of MYK's Bird class, the MYK Wren, for example. This was a Category 4 container ship up there at 370 metres by 50 metres beam, but with a very, very slow speed diesel. The full ahead revolutions on that ship were right down at 38 RPM. And although this gave a big propeller, it didn't give the manoeuvrability that we would really like in Southampton to negotiate, especially our notorious West Bramble term. When the ships would come in at a deep draft, 13 metres and above, they became quite unwieldy on these turns, and so we had to introduce escort towage. So that is a tug that is made fast to the centre lead of the aft part of the ship in order to assist the ship during the turns. And this was a hallmark, if you like, of these early ultra-large container vessels. Great big size, but minimal fuel, trying to increase the efficiency of this size of ship. By the time we got to 2017, 2018, we started to get some really big ships being built. And when these bigger ships were built, the engines were powered up accordingly, and it made them a lot easier to handle. A great example being the ULCS Hong Kong, which came to and from Southampton in those late 2010s. 21,000 TEUs. We've now gone up to what we would call a Category 6 vessel. So we've increased up to 400 metres now, and the beams are starting to approach 60 metres. Now, these ships are very, very, shall we say, handled very well compared to some of the earlier Category 4 vessels. So compared to the 370 metre low powered ships, these Category 6 at 400 metres had a lot more power to them. Now, they were of course born during the COVID era. So although launched in the late 2010s, some of them were mothballed very, very quickly and left to sit doing nothing for several months during COVID. Also during COVID, we saw maintenance on these ships drop. And so we find occasionally we get ships that were built 2019, 2018 with this 20,000 plus capacity that actually have engine problems because the first few years of maintenance wasn't done properly due to COVID and the change in trading patterns, the change in crew rotations meant that essential maintenance perhaps wasn't carried out as it should. But then as we moved into the 2020s, we saw a new class of ship being built, and that is what we term the Megamax container ship. Megamax container ships, which the HMM Southampton from last night is one of, these have got capacities which now exceed 23,000 TEU. They are around 400 metres in length, and the beam has now gone over 60 metres. So the HMM Southampton at 61.5 metre wide. This has massively increased the TEU capacity. Now, lessons have been learnt since those Category 4 ships with the slower speed diesels, and we now find that what we call our Category 7 vessels, our 400 metre by 61 metre beam vessels, they don't mess around with the machinery on there. They have extremely powerful main engines, extremely big rudders, and very, very big bow thrusters. And this enables them to be brought in and out of the port of Southampton with much more efficiency. They're much handier on the turns, and indeed we need not take our escort tug until the ships get pretty deep. So the new class of container vessel that we're seeing, these new Megamax ships, are built to maximize maneuverability because the ship owners know that we are getting near to the maximum size that port infrastructure can handle. So there was no way they were going to build these absolutely huge vessels and not provide them with the engine power and rudder capacity that they needed to negotiate what are now fairly tight-fitting ports. Port infrastructure, although during the 90s massively increased, and indeed in Southampton over the last 5 years we've done a lot of dredging in order to bring these huge Megamax ships into different berths within Southampton. The main port infrastructure changes came through the 90s and into the 2000s. So here we are in 2025 with these Megamax container ships pretty much at the maximum size for the ports at which they call into. Now, will ships get any bigger? Will they go to, say, a Category 8? We did do some trials in Southampton on the simulator where we looked at berthing 425 metre ships with 62 metre beams. This would take the TEU capacity up to around 24 to 26,000 TEU, but we are starting to get to the limit of what ports can actually deal with, and many ports simply can't go any deeper or wider to accommodate bigger ships because of the expense that would be incurred by the port, and of course the limitations on some of the huge dredging projects which would need to happen. These limitations would be environmental and planning limitations from the individual port governments. So we could go slightly bigger than where we are, but going much bigger than 26,000 TEU we require such expensive port reconstruction that if they were built, they would simply be running between perhaps one port in the Far East and one port in Europe, and the expense of that would not be outweighed by the profits that a specialist ship going from one port to the other would get. So therefore there would be diminishing returns on the profits made from such a ship. Larger ships do offer economies of scale, but of course with economies of scale comes catches. They take longer to unload and load, port congestion increases, and therefore supply chain flexibility decreases. So these huge ships, there's a lot of logistics that must be put into place in the port. And if the port isn't capable of handling such huge amounts, then ships are delayed. The delay has a knock-on effect to approaching vessels, and that starts to push up their fuel use for the miles they've travelled in the time scale that they are expected to arrive in the port. And this is not good for the ship owner. It drives up his fuel bill, and it makes for poor reading when it comes to looking at the actual amount of fuel that a ship uses to operate a certain loop. So we may not quite have reached the top economy of scale with our Megamax container ships such as the HMM Southampton that I brought in yesterday, but we're almost there. And the port infrastructure probably won't happen because of the cost of it, and therefore we're pretty much getting to the maximum size of container ship. Thank you very much everyone for listening to this podcast, and I look forward to welcoming you to the next episode. In the meantime guys, do have a great day, and I'll speak to you again soon.